Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstenson, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. And today I'm here with Deirdre Reddan, who is an eating disorder coach and a parent coach, and she works with both parents and individuals. And she also jointly runs online programs for parents affected by eating disorders, which she does with Susanna, whose second name I cannot pronounce. Gajewicz. Okay, thanks, Deirdre, for helping me out there. And we will talk a bit more about that. And the two, Susanna and Deirdre's joint work is under the banner of Supported Families. She is also an associate instructor with Youth Mental Health First Aid Ireland, and Deirdre is really passionate about on the topic of disordered eating and eating disorders. And I know this because we've had some conversations prior to this, and the importance of educating and raising awareness around this complex and often misunderstood area. She is also passionate about supporting parents who are often the untapped superpower when a person is unwell. And she has delivered numerous workshops and webinars to both sporting and large commercial organizations and to healthcare professionals. So thank you so much for being here, Deirdre. I'm very excited about having this conversation today, actually.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Lynn.
Yeah. So in a previous conversation that we had prior to recording this, you told me that being an eating disorder coach and working with young people and parents was not kind of your first career that you had a previous career. So, do you want to talk a little bit about how you kind of ended up in this space and how you come to do this work?
Yeah, no problem at all. Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to chat to you today. I'm looking forward to it too. So yes, in a past life, I used to work in banking. So I worked in banking for 27 years. And enjoyed that career, I have to say. But when my daughter was a teenager, she developed an eating disorder. She developed anorexia and was very unwell for a number of years. And thankfully is well now and is just about to head off to Australia, breaking all of our hearts in the process. But I guess during the time when she was unwell, I invested a lot of time in and energy and effort in kind of trying to support her, I guess, through her recovery. And I might touch a little bit later, maybe on kind of the lessons I learned and what I would invert. But when I left banking, I guess why I left banking really was when she recovered, she became a role model for me. She built the life she wanted for herself. She built the career she wanted. She had her friends and all the rest of it. And I guess I decided I wanted to build the life I wanted. After going through something like that changes your perspective on life. I think it is one of the hardest things you can go through in life. So I decided I wanted to do something different. And I wasn't sure what the different was, but I remembered from my banking career that I was always really interested in people, developing and mentoring and coaching people. I always managed large teams. So I retrained as a coach. And I knew I kind of didn't really want to stay fully in the corporate world. I left for a reason. I wanted to change and do things differently. And then I was trying to figure out what would I do with my coaching? And I guess the piece that always stuck with me was parents and how lonely and isolating it can be as a parent. And I remember having a coffee one day with somebody, a former colleague, and he said, well, think about what's different about you and what's unique about you as a coach. And for me, it was eating disorders, funnily enough, and coaching. So I trained in eating disorders and put that together with my coaching to work initially with parents. So kind of bringing together, I suppose, my own skills and experience and then the technical knowledge that I had trained in.
And I think that being able to bring in that lived experience gives a different depth of understanding, I think. and your lived experience as a parent of a child who's been unwell with an eating disorder. And I feel sometimes it's like you said, like it's a really lonely experience. And I wonder, like, when your daughter first got sick, like what kind of resources or where did you sort of go looking for information?
So I guess it's changing, I think. And actually one of the things I reread recently was one of the books that I used a lot when she was unwell, was the new Maudsley book. It's a Janet Treasure book. So Janet Treasure is very well known in the field of eating disorders. And it was skills, like teaching parent skills. And I suppose what I really liked about it was because it was using coaching conversation. So it sat very well with me, as the same as my training. But the thing I remembered when I looked at the book recently was there was a line in it that said eating disorders are relatively rare. And that is really changing. They're not relatively rare. They're far more common than people realize or understand. So back then, I suppose, Lynn, to answer your question, that was a good few years ago now that she became unwell. And there wasn't as much available information. I remember turning to Bodywise. They do have a lot of good information and resources for parents and professionals on their website. But you never quite know at the start what you're dealing with, and often with eating disorders, they can come with other mental illnesses. So they very often coexist with anxiety. So sometimes you think, oh my goodness, if you can get support for the anxiety, maybe that'll help the eating. And it takes a while for parents really to realize or recognize what's actually going on. And I think that's one of the big challenges about eating disorders. Like, they are really complex illnesses. They do have high mortality rates. They're misunderstood. People don't understand them. But equally, and what's really, really important, one of my key messages that I'd like to leave with you today, people do recover. People recover fully. So there's always a message of hope around them as well.
That's so important, I think, both for any like caregiver or parent or other support person with the person who's unwell, and also for the person themselves who are living with an eating disorder and is on that recovery journey, that there is hope that it can actually be so much better. And like, did somebody give you that book and say, here, Deirdre, okay, you need to read this? Or did you have to did you have to go look for this yourself? Like, how, I suppose, in your experience, and I know we can talk about more like the work that you do now, like, what was your role as a parent in the team that was supporting your daughter and the young person?
So I would say we were fortunate in a way eventually. So it takes time. It takes a long time to kind of get the right people. And it's a long journey. And, really, really important that if parents believe there's an issue, and we'll come to this maybe when we talk about, early warning signs, but the parents get the right professionals, the appropriately qualified professionals, because eating disorders are complex. Normal counselor and therapist training doesn't encompass eating disorders. So it's so critically important you have a qualified person on the dietitian or nutrition side, like yourself, Lynn, and that you have somebody who's providing psychological support who's appropriately qualified too. I can't stress that enough. I really can't. But in terms of our experience, we were lucky. Yeah, we were involved to an extent, I guess. And we were fortunate at the time that she was under 18, so we could engage more with the treatment team. And I have really strong views on parents being involved when the individual is over 18, because they don't just wake up one day and become a fully fledged adult when they turn 18. So parents really have such a key role to play, no matter the age of the loved one. I'm so passionate about that. So we were lucky, I think, at the time, looking back. I think things have improved, but again, there's a lot more that can be improved around involving parents, because as you said in your introduction, like they're the superpower, they're the ally, they are the experts on the child. No matter what age the child is, the parents know more about the child than anybody else.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting you said it. This has been partly my experience, particular in that kind of space of somebody who's like 18 to maybe 21, 22, because now they're kind of like independent adults, and that is a different dynamic than with consent and communication with, for me as a practitioner, I don't have to communicate. Like, my client is my client, so it's between the two of us how we decide to communicate with the parents. But often, particularly if the person is fairly unwell, they live at home. So like it feels to me that if that system can be tapped into as a resource for them, even though they're no longer, under 18, it feels a little bit like a missed opportunity. Because especially if they live at home, like the support network can be there just by proximity in different, like in ways that somebody who's maybe a bit older, 25, 30, or like living independently, you might not have the same parental support system to tap into. So yeah, I don't know if that's what you've seen as well in your work.
Yeah, I agree completely. There's a perception sometimes from young people of, that age group that you just referenced. I have to do this on my own. Eating disorder recovery is too bloody hard to do on your own. It really, really is. And there are days when you need that support. So I think parents, I always quote this statistic that there are 169 hours in the week, and if your loved one is receiving outpatient support, they're an hour a week with the therapist, maybe half an hour to an hour with the dietitian or nutritional therapist. That's a lot of hours at home if they're living at home. And if the parents aren't empowered and equipped to support the young person, it's very challenging. And realistically, it makes the job of the professionals harder, because there isn't somebody kind of reinforcing the messages or being supportive at home. And I think the concern that people often have, the key concern, is the breach of confidentiality. And they're an adult, and preserving the relationship between the professional, the dietitian, nutritional therapist, or the therapist. But being honest, they're involving the family in a safe way with full consent, in supporting the young person, can make such a difference. And I suppose one of the things I would experience in my work is that it can be the language that we use. So sometimes as parents, we don't realize, because how would we? We were never taught. We don't realize that the language we're using is triggering and is just creating anxiety or heightening the anxiety for the person. So even I always give an example of working with the family a number of years ago, and they had one child who was recovering from anorexia, and the other was in a larger body, slightly larger body. So every mealtime they sat at the table and they asked one child to eat more, the other child to eat less. And the impact that was having on the young person recovering from anorexia. So helping the parents understand that impact and changing their language made a significant difference to the young person. And there's no breach of confidentiality there. You're not unveiling any secrets or any concerns or anything that's shared in the therapeutic relationship. It's fully preserved. So I do feel really strongly about the role of parents. And I do think it's changing, and I think it's changing more in the US, that parents are more involved. And more of the same here, please. I think really.
No, I agree with you. And I also feel sometimes like for the young person, particularly around that, like 19, 20, and when somebody is, I suppose, inverted commas, not too bad, like they're engaging in eating disorder behaviors that's in an unhelpful way, but they're medically stable, maybe their weight isn't critically low, and they're maybe somewhat functioning, they might be going to college a few days a week or, but like it's still a problem. And it feels sometimes like some might think of some of the young people I worked with like, well, I don't want to worry my parents. I should be able to do this by myself. And kind of also, and this might be my assumptions, also feeling like, well, we're supporting our son or daughter with, they're getting therapy and they're going to nutrition professionals and they're getting the support. But it's like, from where I'm sitting then, it's like, well, like all that space in between the sessions where they could possibly benefit with some structure to make the meals happen and, making sure that the eating is regularly happening and not having so much like pressure that they have to do that by themselves because it's already hard. Like it's harder than it would be if they didn't, then they would be if they didn't have an eating disorder. And I mean, I don't know about you, but like feeding ourselves can be challenging at times anyway, just because of life. But it just feels like, right, if there was a bit of structure support provided at home, even just to make the eating more consistent and take a bit of pressure off the person having to, cook for themselves, or even sometimes they like to cook for themselves because that gives control. But it's that kind of
cook and not eat.
Yeah. And I just feel like, oh, right. Do we need to have a conversation about this maybe? And I'm thinking out loud, I have somebody in my head. I'm like, maybe we need to have a conversation here. Should we bring the parents in for a joint conversation of what does this level of support maybe that needs to be happen to take a bit of pressure off the young person's. It feels like for me like a lot to hold when you're already struggling, that it just having somebody else supporting you making some of these things happen, and the language that you talked about could just give a bit more space for like the healing to occur. So that's kind of,
totally. And I think some of it, as I said earlier, like lots of people don't really understand what disordered eating or eating disorders are. So we live in a culture where, exercise is praised and rewarded, where healthy eating, and I know you can't see me, but I have air quotes around the healthy, is praised. So we're oftentimes people, when they start developing issues around food, everybody praises them. Oh my God, you're looking great. You've lost weight. You're eating more healthily. It's great that you're exercising so much. And I suppose the difference between kind of normal behaviors and eating disorder behaviors is the level of obsession and compulsion around the exercise, around the thinking about food. So, I know you know this, but, people who struggle with their relationship with food could spend 80 or 90% of their day thinking about food. Like, how lonely is that? So again, so we're not good at spotting the signs necessarily because of the culture we're surrounded by. That's nobody's fault. It's just the language we've grown up with, and how people talk about food. So a lot of the times in the work I do, when I deliver corporate webinars or to parents, we always talk about food as a treat. Oh, you've been very good today. You can have an ice cream. Why can't we go to the park? Why can't we go for a swim? Can we just change the language around food? So we've good foods and bad foods, and we punish ourselves when we've eaten bad foods. So that makes the landscape a little bit murky in terms of spotting the issue in the first instance. Another kind of issue, I guess, would be there's a perception that eating disorders only affect white teenage females.
Yeah. So speak to me about, I think both of those are really important things to talk about. So let's just come back to speak to me about what are the early signs. Like if you're a parent listening to this and you have a young person or even an older young person, what are the signs? Like when should you start kind of going, maybe something isn't really right here? Because obviously, puberty happens and it's like lots of changes and turmoil and, gathering independence and like all of those, like that's normal and part of that phase of life, but at what point, or what are the things where as a parent you should be kind of like, I'm not so sure if things are actually right?
So again, I would say the first thing I would say to parents is to listen to your gut. You are the expert in your child. You know if something is wrong. So trust that. And I guess around, it's really around the behaviors. So again, people perceive eating disorders or disordered eating even as being about food. And they're not just about food. Yes, they are about food, but they're about other things too. So has the behavior changed? Are they eating differently? So, and again, eating behaviors exist on a spectrum. So you can restrict eating and overeat at the other end. And at both ends and in the middle, you can have an eating disorder. So eating disorders don't discriminate. I think only 6% of people who have an eating disorder are underweight. So, and they increasingly are affecting men and boys as much as females, whether that's because it's become more visible or there's more awareness and acknowledgement around it, I'm not sure. But again, they're not female only. They do not only, you don't only have an eating disorder if you're significantly underweight. They can affect anybody. We can't tell by looking at somebody they have an eating disorder. So I think that's really important in terms of the misconceptions. And another misconception, just before I go on to the early warning signs, and maybe it ties back into what you were saying a minute ago about the parents. If you think about it, if a young person is getting support for another mental health issue, like anxiety or depression, they're experiencing anxiety or depression, they go and see the therapist and that's it. Yes, they do homework in between sessions, but you have to eat 3 times a day. You have to eat 6 times a day if you're suffering from an eating disorder. So parents don't understand, I think, the illness, the challenges. And again, there's no manual for being a parent of somebody who has an eating disorder. You really have to learn new skills and figure it out. So that's important, maybe just to highlight that. In terms of the early warning signs, it's changing behaviors around food. It can be anything, really. So there's no definitive list. But some of the things, somebody starts healthy eating, only eating low-fat foods, no longer eat their favorite foods. So they say, oh no, I can't eat that now, that's too fatty. They start making excuses. I've eaten already, I won't have dinner. I had something after school. They start avoiding social occasions where there's food. So they mightn't want to go to the cinema because the friends eat beforehand or get popcorn. Their mood changes. So, they're much more withdrawn. They're less likely to go out with their friends. They can focus an awful lot more on how they look. So kind of body checking, seeking, particularly on the restrictive end of the spectrum where somebody's under eating, asking constantly of their parents, am I fat? And again, as parents, we like to solve problems. So we say, oh, no, you're not. And that's not helpful necessarily. They can become really, really focused on sport. So they can't see their friends because they haven't done their walk, their run, their gym. So they're exercising for a long period of time. And then at the other end of the spectrum where somebody is overeating or is purging, so perhaps vomiting after meals, they're going to the bathroom after dinner, spending a long time in there, running the shower, brushing their teeth immediately after being in the bathroom. Food wrappers are being found in their bedroom. Food is going missing from the cupboards. But so food is only one part of it. There's something has changed in your child. They're withdrawn. Their mood is low. They're not going out with their friends as much. And the foods that they used to eat and enjoy, the language around the foods has changed. And they're much more focused on, examining labels, reading calorie contents, all that kind of stuff, I think.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's like, and I suppose that's also, when you're saying that, that's like that coming back to that language piece again, to be sort of looking for these signs and not kind of feeding into praising that kind of behavior. It's great you're so health conscious, and it's great, you're exercising, or you know, and I'm thinking as well, like stories that I've heard or read, particularly from maybe children or young people in bigger bodies, and they're starting on their quote unquote health journey by like changing how they're eating and exercising more, and the praise that, oh, you're so great and it's like so good. And then all of a sudden, actually, like they lose a lot of weight and they might still not be in that critical, like what looks like severe underweight, but for their body, that's where they're at because they've lost a lot of weight in a short space of time. And all the behaviors they mentioned sort of escalated. And it's kind of like, because of this distortion we have then around what eating disorders look like and what bodies should look like, and the pervasiveness of thin ideology or thin obsession we have with thinness, it's like it often gets missed even potentially more in those people.
Yeah, and you know this only too well yourself from your own work, but you can be just as malnourished in a larger body as in an underweight body. And you know, I think this gets lost too. And one of this when I deliver training as part of my youth mental health first aid work, one of the stats we share, because it's for adults who support young people, the training, and one of the stats we share, which horrified me, was that 70% of young girls, this was a survey done in 2019, but 70% of young girls between the ages of 12 to 19 were either on a diet or trying not to gain weight. And yet, as we go through puberty and as we go through any hormonal change in life, we are designed to gain weight. That's how our body works. So putting young people on diets, we're kind of fighting against nature, I suppose, in some ways. So, you know, it's really important as young people go through puberty, that their bodies, particularly girls, that their bodies, they do change and they do gain weight, and that's normal and natural. So we have to be really careful, I think, you know, and dieting, becoming vegetarian when there's no kind of, when vegetarianism isn't prevalent in the family, it's not kind of, you know, an ethical stance the family have taken, which is perfectly fine. So it's anything kind of new or different. They really are warning signs that we should be watching out for. And children not gaining weight or losing weight at particular times in their life is that's really important. And I suppose the other kind of key point maybe to stress about eating disorders, they're very, as I said at the start, they're complex, and they're often, it's a perfect storm of lots of things coming together. So not everybody is vulnerable to developing an eating disorder, but for those who are vulnerable, who have that maybe genetic vulnerability, who have kind of the psychological character trait or personality traits in being very high achieving and very driven, and environmental triggers, the people who are susceptible, dieting can often be the pathway, you know. And I would hear, as I'm sure do you, people whose mums took them to Slimming World when they were children. And again, that never comes from a position of harm, because the parents feel that that's the right thing, because in a society we do blend weight and health, and we shouldn't.
We shouldn't, and that's like a whole other conversation. But I could think that, like, and also like the like what you just said there, like it's often doesn't come from a place of harm. It's like these are the beliefs that we picked up from society, and I think sometimes as well when maybe the parents have lived experience of being in a larger body and weight stigma and maybe bullying and other things that comes with that. Why would you not want that for your child and trying to do that? But that's the difficulty in then trusting our children with their bodies, and also trusting ourselves with our own bodies, that they are infinitely wise and they know what to do, and our job is just to take care of them and not manipulate them. So there was something, so say now, right, if you're starting noticing that maybe there's something going on here in my child, and all of a sudden they're vegan, and then like this sort of out of the blue, where I'm like, they don't want to eat their favorite foods anymore, or they're just, you know, starting to go on for long walks and you're just feeling like something isn't right, like then where do you go as a parent? Like, what are you going to do then? Like, what's the next thing that needs to happen? Or,
Yeah. So the piece just about kind of the parents always trying to do the best thing for their children. Sometimes as parents, we feel, such guilt, which we shouldn't, because really important as well to stress that parents don't cause an eating disorder. The individual doesn't choose it. It's a very complex interplay of lots of different things, as I just said. So they're nobody's fault. And years ago, there was a theory that it was the parents' fault. It's not. So parents will feel guilt. They will feel terror and fear. And they'll feel, oh my goodness, did I do things wrong in the past? But it's only as, I always use this Maya Angelou quote, when we know better, we do better. Yeah. So when we learn, so the behaviors or the things that we thought were a good idea in the past, we learn. So there's no manual, we're learning as we go. So I think parents have to be really kind to themselves around stuff they may have done in the past, because it came from a position of love. Nobody ever sets out to harm. So I just think that's really important just to stress that. So in terms of kind of where do you go, I would say certainly no harm to look up online. We have information on our Supportive Families website. Bodywise also are a good resource. But typically the first port of call is the GP, because the GP is really the pathway into mental health services in Ireland. And again, I suppose back to what I said earlier about the parents or the expert and their child, if there's something not right. And if the GP is telling you, oh no, they're fine, there's nothing wrong, trust your gut and push a little bit harder, because all GPs, there's some great, fantastic GPs out there, and we were lucky we had one. But not all GPs understand eating disorders. So don't rest if you're not concerned. And another port of call, Lynn, would certainly be somebody in your profession who has an understanding of nutrition and can kind of, because again, somebody who has developed a distorted relationship with food will have, I always describe it, it's like War and Peace. They'll have this big book of food rules. Or somebody described it, they're going around with a backpack on their back with all this stuff. I must, I should. Yeah. And it's all wrong, because it's not coming from the right place. So sometimes in the early stages, and again, I can't stress enough, it is getting support from somebody who understands the area and has enough training. But even just the re-education piece can be helpful in terms of going through nutrition with somebody and helping them to understand what they actually need to fuel their body every day. Yeah. And it's, and as like, it's so, for a young person, again, their brain is still developing and growing, and you need about 500 calories a day just for your brain. Yeah. So if you're not taking on board the right food, there's an impact in terms of your cognitive abilities too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of piece as well where, when you were saying like dieting can often, like, it's not the only piece, but like there's multifactorial, but it can be that piece that sort of opens the door for this trajectory of into disordered eating and maybe even a full-blown eating disorder. And for some people, it's that drop in weight that is signaling to their body like something is off. And then for some people, this is where the eating actually gets harder. Whereas for most people, like how it technically should work, is like if we don't get enough food, once the food becomes available, we'll eat more. And that seems like binge eating, which it can turn into, but it's kind of like, that's how we but for some people, it doesn't function that way, and it gets harder, and the food obsession and the thinking and the anxiety and all those are starting to snowball as the weight are dropping. And you sent me this really great article, and I will link to this in the show notes as well. But somebody, Emily, what's her Emily? Boring, yeah. And talking about her own lived experience and how bringing the weight set point or baseline up so that there is a buffer for somebody that has this experience, that if they And I've seen this with some of my clients as well. Like if they had just like a tummy bug for a couple of days and they even just dropped like a few pounds, not a lot, but because they're on very close to that threshold, all of a sudden, all the sort of like eating disorder behaviors or thinking is starting to ramp up again. And they know like once they're kind of getting back on consistent eating and eating enough, life just feels a bit more easeful, you know, they're not as anxious anymore. Than like it's just they have more capacity. And it's just it continues to build that buffer. And she talks about like weight recovery set points, and like that sometimes they're like within the hospital setting, which is great to save lives, but like it's sometimes it's not enough. And I think, and again, going back to what we spoke earlier about, particularly with people in higher weight bodies or kids or young people in bigger bodies, it's the body that has that reference point. So that cannot be determined outside of that, which is why sometimes people look at growth charts and where the person was tracking before the eating disorders to get up to what looks like there seems to be a normal baseline for that particular individual. And I just think that's so, like, it's so fascinating that there's such a big part of physiology as part of this also mental illness.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things about this area, and we could talk forever, like it's the science is evolving all the time, and there is sort of a school of thought now that, you know, there's a metabolic component to it as well. So for some people, as you've said, it's just triggered physiologically. It's just when the weight goes, you know, so an eating disorder can develop without any, not that they're ever a choice, but, you know, that somebody hasn't started dieting or anything like that. It's just purely metabolic. So that's just so important in terms of recovery as well, that it's not the minimum weight. It has to be more than that.
I think that's absolutely. And I feel as well, like for the person who's living with the eating disorders, like continues to reinforcing that, because sometimes like people get that message and that becomes, the eating disorder picks up that message. So this becomes the minimums becomes the top ceiling, because that's really comfortable for the eating disorder. But like that's still keeping people kind of stuck there in that sort of semi-recovery place. And you know, unfortunately, again, which is why I suppose, you know, the work that you do in the early science is like the sooner people get intervention and the sooner that weight and the psychological support can happen, the higher the chance of full recovery, and the shorter, I think, the trajectory as well. But when people then get sort of in that well, they're kind of functioning, but like they're thinking about food a lot, and it's just, they kind of get stuck there, and it's like, well, this is how I am, and this, you know, it becomes more sort of, I suppose, embedded in people's personalities, and it's like it feels like there's more to come if you keep going. But the support to do there, I think, it's just too hard and too much to ask somebody to try to do that all by themselves.
Totally. And it is so worth it. And the one question I am always asked by parents is, you know, where are we on the recovery journey? And full recovery is certainly worth holding on for and keeping going for. And I guess back to kind of the question you asked about where do you go for help? And sometimes, you know, parents can be reluctant to seek help. There's still a lot of stigma. And for boys and men, you know, it's a mental health illness and it's perceived to be a female illness. It's a huge stigma for them too. And again, that's probably a whole other topic. But there's a lot of stigma around it. And parents sometimes might think, you know, it's just anxiety around the Leaving Cert and it'll all be fine when the Leaving Cert is over. And maybe it isn't. So I would always say to parents, check it out. Like, what is the worst that can happen? What harm have you done by checking it out and there isn't a problem? Yeah. So having a conversation with the GP, speaking to somebody, you know, having a consultation with a qualified professional like yourself or myself, just even to kind of talk through what's going on in your head and get a steer. We do run an early warnings webinar as well, but just informing yourself. And if you're wrong, there's no harm done. There really isn't. And the other piece, you know, which we kind of touched on when we were talking about that article, eating disorders are very unique in lots of ways. And unfortunately, one of the ways that they're particularly unique is the medical risk that can come with them. So when you're not feeding your body appropriately, and again, you cannot feed your body appropriately in a smaller body or a larger body, it can have medical consequences. It can affect your brain, and it can have serious consequences. And I don't want to be upsetting people by going into them.
Yeah.
But it is so important that medical, and that's why the role of the GP is important too, that there is medical oversight or there is medical checkup. Because somebody who becomes extremely underweight, their heart is at risk. And these, again, because people don't understand about eating disorders, these are the things that come and hit you out of left field. You know, I used to always say it's the gift that keeps giving, because there can be potential side effects. Now, again, in the interests of, remaining positive, a lot of those impacts can reverse significantly, very significantly with recovery. So the message of hope is really, really important.
Yeah.
But the longer that somebody is suffering, potentially the more damage that can be caused to the body. So it is, fertility impacts as well. So it's so important that we check something out early.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like, when young people are unfortunate to end up on this kind of path, they might be lucky enough to have their parents still there keeping an eye out to be getting on top of it. Whereas if you develop an eating disorder later on in life, it might be even more lonely because there's nobody else necessarily sort of picking up on it in the same way. So,
but equally, Lynn, sorry,
yeah.
I have worked with mums whose children are in their 30s, and the mums are trying to figure out how can they best support them. So the support is still there. It might be different. They mightn't live with the parents, but the parents still are trying to do their best to support their loved one. And sometimes these are people who maybe are semi-recovered, as you've described it. And all the parents want for them is, them to have the opportunity to live life to the fullest. And there can be reluctance on the part of the person because they feel this is as good as it's going to get. But there is still hope for further recovery. So you will often have, I suppose, parents sitting in the wings just waiting to kind of try and help support. That has been my experience on a number of occasions.
That's so wonderful to hear that, I think, because that's really important too. And just mean that, if you're not 16 or 18, it doesn't mean that you don't deserve support or that you can't asking for, family support. And that just makes me curious as well, Deirdre. Like, I know you work with families, and we think about like families, the parents or caregivers of the young person, but like you just talked about a slightly different experience there. So when it comes to like partners or other people, like particularly if we're talking about somebody who's a bit older, like do you support those people as well?
Yeah, so there's a great expression, it's not mine, that having an eating disorder in the family is like a bomb going off. So it impacts everybody, not just the person. So it impacts the parents. If somebody's older, it impacts the partner, the husband, wife, and it impacts the siblings. So there, and again, we just, these are the things we don't think of, I suppose, really. And, so for the sibling, it can be that the parents are just so focused, understandably, on supporting the person who's affected by an eating disorder. The siblings can be, they feel like they're not getting a lot of attention, but they have their own fears and worries and concerns. And then they don't want to burden the parents with those because they can see that the parents are overloaded as it is. And the partner relationship is different, but again, the impact is still significant. So yes, I have worked with partners and siblings as well. And, it's helpful for everybody when everybody gets support. So it's, so for parents or partners or siblings, they're supporting themselves, but they can also enhance the support they're already providing to their loved one by understanding more about the illness.
Yeah. And when you talk about support as well, particularly as a parent, and even like when you're sort of coming out the other end of it and you've done this sort of intense work around refeeding and supporting them and making it through, and the young person is like well on the road to recovery, like in your experience as a parent, then like what kind of like support after like you've made this true and the impact it's had and the change it's had on you as a person and maybe other family members, like what can that sort of like support look like as in I'm thinking about like processing the experience that everybody just had, and obviously it is different for each person in the family system that the impact it's had on them. So yeah, can I speak to that?
Yeah, so as I said at the start, like it is one of the hardest things you will go through as a parent, undoubtedly, because it's exhausting. It is emotionally and physically exhausting. It's all you think about. Because food is such an integral part of our lives. Like one of the pieces of advice, we attended a new Maudsley workshop way back, and one of the pieces of advice and it was really helpful. And one of the pieces of advice that I now advise parents is not to talk about food or weight or body image at the dinner table. And I never knew how much we talked about food until we couldn't. So it's exhausting because you're putting your game face on before dinners. You're worried, are they going to eat? And then when they do get to a point, and it's a long journey, unfortunately, and there are bumps along the way, and the bumps are actually a good thing, because I suppose, as I always describe it, the bumps are telling you that the toolbox isn't quite full, and the tools that the person needs to manage the bumps in life is not fully functional. So there's something that needs to be topped up, or it needs to be looked at. So we learn from the bumps along the way. So you're going through all of that process. It's all going on. I remember somebody saying to me at that workshop, I think, self-care. And I was like, what? How can I look after myself? I have to look after her. But actually, and it's really important that you do that. And as you go through the recovery process, then there comes a point, exactly as you've said, where they're beginning to fly. And it's so wonderful because they come back to who they were. And you can see them. It's like they're coming out of, whatever they've been in. So their personality is reemerging, who they are. And I get that in feedback from parents all the time. We had another piece of feedback yesterday, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Just to see the young person going on and living their life. But for the parents, and again, I always describe it, it's like a tightrope. You're empowering the young person, because a lot of it is about empowering them. A lot of recovery is about empowering them. But you're also kind of still giving them support and making sure they don't fall off the tightrope. And for parents, it can be really hard to step back and to trust the recovery. That can be so hard for parents because you're so focused on it. You have no power over recovery, but you can support it. So there's a lot for parents. Yeah. So I think I would say myself, I was probably burnt out when I look back on it now. So I also now coach mums whose children are at that point in recovery. But the mums have kind of lost themselves because they have to go, and dads, in fairness, sorry, it just so happens recently it's mums I've been working with, because the dads play such a key role as well. They have different strengths often to bring to it. But you lose yourself because it just becomes, it's all consuming and overwhelming when you're going through it. So it's really important. Self-compassion is so important, that you kind of look after yourself as you go through this. And it might feel like, oh my goodness, how can I manage that? But it's so important that you do.
Yeah. Thank you it's good for me to know as well, to be sending people your way to do that too. Yeah, like you said, I could just imagine like that it just takes up every space of everyone's life. And then you get to a point, well, how are we going to navigate out of this now? And also, what am I going to do with all my free time as a
Yeah.
parent. And, and also like it makes totally sense if, you're coming out of that and feeling quite burnt out as well. And
Yeah.
you're navigating, self-care and basic self-care as well. But I suppose also having support through the process so that as a parent, you can stay the course too.
Yeah. And it's, and again, and like the young people kind of just move on, and it's like it never happened, in lots of cases, they just put it behind them, which is amazing,
That is
and
fabulous.
fantastic. But for the parents, it's harder to do that because it is still kind of so, it's so prevalent. And I guess too, the going through the process piece and the work that Susanna and I do, we support parents across all of the recovery process. So really from the very early warning signs to the other end, when you're kind of trying to get your life back, I guess, and teaching skills, helping parents understand that the recovery process can unfortunately be longer than maybe we would like, but also helping parents to recognize that there are small things, small good things that happen along the way. And again, as humans, we tend to focus on the negatives. That's how our brains are wired, unfortunately. And we lose sight of the little positives. So it's so important to keep up the motivation for parents as well, and to recognize that, okay, there may still be behaviors there, but yes, there has been small pieces of progress. So I always suggest to parents that they have a little review every week and just write down the positives. And then if there's a bad day or a bad week, they can see that actually, do you know what? There has been little positives.
Yeah.
Because the illness doesn't appear overnight, even though sometimes it might feel like it does. So it does take time to unwind it, I suppose.
That's and it takes often longer than you think. And
there are wins along the way, and I think like we have to really focus on that. There really are, and things that you never thought you would ever do again, like eating out in a restaurant, or they're all possible.
Yeah, it's just, and I think as well for everybody involved in the recovery process, like remember that, because like nothing is linear. It's not like a straight line upward. It kind of goes forward and sort of back a bit, and just seeing that, the trajectory over time is still moving forward. So yeah, remembering those things that are, that were working well or that were possible, and maybe it's just like a little backtrack, but it's like it's coming back on. But I just think I'm so glad we had this conversation, Deirdre, and like that I know you and Susanna are out there, and like the work that you do to support parents in this way. I think they should be cloned all over the place, because I think it feels like, yeah, it's a really powerful part of support. And like you said at the beginning, it's like this untapped resource that is there within most family systems, with the support being available, and also like the kind of education that you guys do in like just even simple things can be helpful, that can really take a lot of, like changing the language and things like that can make such a big difference.
And even, absolutely. And again, and parents sometimes feel, oh, but I don't have an eating disorder. Why should I get support? Or I don't have time for this. Or all my money is being spent on. Unfortunately, our system, our services are far from perfectly equipped, and really not so for eating disorders. So, we have to acknowledge that a lot of parents have to seek help privately, which is not very far from ideal. And again, eating disorders don't discriminate in terms of people's economic or financial well-being. But parents will often say, oh, but I'm focused on getting the child therapy or the dietitian, because often you need both for the reasons we've talked about before. So the parents would feel, well, oh no, sure, I shouldn't be doing this. But actually, there's two reasons I think why you should. One is there is evidence to suggest that the recovery process is accelerated if parents get support too. And the second one is there is a high level of clinical anxiety and depression amongst caregivers who support somebody for an eating disorder. So again, that's proven. So you can actually be far more efficient time-wise. So we ran a webinar on Monday night on autism and eating disorders, which again is another day's conversation, but there are links from a mum, and she said she learned more in our webinar than months of reading books.
Powerful.
So there is a time efficiency piece. As I mentioned at the start, it's such an isolating condition because you don't like talking about it. Parents feel they want to preserve their child's privacy, so they don't talk to anybody about it. So getting support in a group setting, either one-to-one or group, helps you find your tribe. You find parents who are walking the same journey, who understand the language and they understand the challenges. And having, I suppose, the one thing I would say I've learned too is like a lot of it is kind of good parenting tips. And again, when we have a child, there's no manual that arrives in the post telling you how to do everything. But even just learning how to kind of manage our own nervous system, how to manage our own anxieties so that they're not feeding off our anxieties, showing to our loved ones that we're caring for ourselves, so that, because if you think about it, somebody with an eating disorder isn't caring for themselves, not doing it deliberately, but there's no self-care. So even role modeling all those behaviors. So like it is so important. And parents are the ones that love their child the most, and they will do anything for their child. So equipping and empowering parents is so, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so important.
No, I think so. And I think I loved as well how you brought in that, even for the older child, and of course, as long as our parents are still around, we are somebody's child. And as a parent, I'm not a parent myself, but like as somebody who is a parent, I'm sure you'll always be a parent, even if, your kids are 60 or 70, you're still a parent. So, and also knowing that it's not just for young people, where it's worth getting some support for yourself. Even if you have a child who's in their late 20s or 30s struggling with an eating disorder, it's still worth getting some support for yourself to be able to be better equipped to support them.
And even just, absolutely, yes. Knowing, so we always say too, like, and you will know this too, Lynn, we talked earlier about early warning signs and, spotting that there's something not right in your young person. And the key thing about an eating disorder is that it's a functional illness. It serves a purpose for the person. It does something for them. So they are not going to say, oh yeah, I know I have a problem, I'll definitely get help, at the first time you raise a concern with them. So it's all about planting seeds. It's all about kind of letting them know that something's not right, doing it very gently, very calmly, not making it about them, but talking about what you've noticed. And also planting seeds for hope, for recovery, for your hopes and dreams for that person. And as somebody who's a parent of an adult, you can still do all of that. You can still plant the seeds. And getting support and getting the language maybe to use in terms of kind of how you raise those concerns with your loved one can be really helpful. But also it's the piece, exactly as you said earlier, about processing it for yourself, managing the emotions. Like honestly, I firmly believed at the start of all of this that like if I worked hard enough, if I invested enough time, I could fix this. But I couldn't. I could support, and I did, but I couldn't fix it. So as parents, we want to fix things. So it's hard. That's a hard part of the process too, knowing that we can support them, but we can't do it for them.
Yeah.
And learning how to support them, I suppose, as well.
Yeah. And having, sometimes that's why, like, that therapeutic space for oneself is like having somebody to like process that, all the feelings that comes up with, like the out of control, that you can't fix it for them.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, like the work that you do, giving the parents or the caregivers support in all the things that they can do that are helpful and that are within their control and that are really supportive for their young loved one that is struggling. So yeah, I think thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this and learning more about kind of the work. And yeah, we could probably have a whole separate conversation about the lack of support, unfortunately, and the privilege that is needed unfortunately, for a lot of people to pay privately, or you have to meet an awful lot of criteria and wait a long time to get support within the system, and that's a whole other conversation. But I would love for us to close something that I like asking all my guests is, we talked about nourishment and support, and I'm curious for you, Deirdre, what does joyful nourishment mean to you? And what's your favorite way of joyfully nourishing yourself?
So for me, I would say I thankfully have never had issues with food. So making sure I nourish my body appropriately to enable me live the life I want to live is very important for me. And then so I suppose it's kind of mind and body, really, isn't it? So when I rebuilt my life after I left banking, I went back to the piano. So after a very long number of years. So I find that really nourishing, really enjoy that, and really enjoy ice swim. I'm fortunate enough to not live so far from the sea. So that's something I started doing the last few years ago, which I just find amazing for mind and body. And exercise is important to me. So I'm active. I really like being outside and making time for being outside. And it's so important for the parents I work with too, just to make the time. Like you can kind of shift your mindset, your nervous system, how you feel by even just a 10-minute walk, even the small little things and being outside. And then I love reading as well, reading more so than watching TV.
Yeah, I'm probably a bit like that. Like we don't have a TV in our house, but my partner loves movies. So since we got together, I've seen more movies probably in the last 4 years than I saw in the last 10 previous, I think. But for choice, I'd probably go with the book before something on a screen.
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you so much. And where can people find you if they want to go and look at all the amazing work that you do and that you and Susanna offer as well?
Yes, so it's www.supportivefamilies.ie. So I suppose just to mention, Susanna is a clinical psychologist, certified eating disorder specialist, and family therapist. So we kind of bring the professional and the personal together, I guess, in terms of our experiences. And we're running an autumn webinar series at the moment. Our next one is next Monday night on body image. And then we run a monthly support group, and we will be relaunching a group program that we run early in the new year, which is equipping parents with the tools and skills that they need, because it's a great unknown for parents, and it's just learning how to try things with confidence. Actually, that's one of the final things I would say. So for parents, they feel like they're walking on eggshells. They don't know what to say. Everything they say is wrong, and they become terrified to say anything at all. So giving parents the confidence to proactively support their loved ones, I suppose, is kind of why we do what we do.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. And I will link to that in the show notes and a few other resources that we also mentioned throughout. So again, thank you so much, Deirdre.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it, Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.